And now for the second part of the Epic of Gilgamesh lecture. This talk covers tablets 7 through 11. Okay, the Epic of Gilgamesh, He Who Saw the Deep. Just to remind you about assignment 1, the content I'm going over in this talk shouldn't intersect too much with any of the committee's topics. Maybe it will, maybe a little bit, but for the most part, I'm kind of steering away from ground that you will cover in your own research. But here's the committees. I look forward to looking at these topics in more depth with you guys next time. Okay, so the Epic of Gilgamesh. You probably noticed in reading this latter half of the epic that there is quite an arc for Gilgamesh's character. He begins the epic in all his glory. So just to remind you from last time, this is a man he's not even just a man. He's 2/3 God, only 1/3 human. He's enormous. He's the most handsome person. He's very, very strong, very, very capable. The first half of the epic consists of all of his feats of strength and valor and bravery. So it's quite striking in the second half of the epic when we meet Gilgamesh again and he looks completely different. So I'll read these lines. This is in response to someone asking him why he looks so haggard, why he looks so worn. He says, "Why should my cheeks not be hollow, my face not sunken, my mood not wretched, my visage not wasted?" Visage being a fancy word for face. He's like, why shouldn't I be, ugly, haggard? Why shouldn't I look old? Should not sorrow reside in my heart, and my face not resemble one come from afar? Should not my features be burnt by frost and by sunshine? And should I not wander in a wild lion's garb? So just, take some time to think about how striking this difference is between the Gilgamesh we met at the beginning and the Gilgamesh that we end the epic with. He's wandering around in the wild with the garb of a lion, so, I guess a pelt. He looks very sad. He looks like he's not from the local place. He looks like he's come from afar. His features are burnt by being too cold and too much sun. He's sunburned, I guess. He's wretched. He's wasted. This is completely different of a guy. And not only that, he looks old. His cheeks are hollowed out, sunken. What happened to this man? You might have noticed in those descriptions, thinking about what Gilgamesh looked like at the beginning, something probably like this. He ends up looking a lot like Enkidu. The wild lion's garb, looking a little bit rough. It's rather interesting that Gilgamesh's arc in the epic starts to cross lines with the arc of Enkidu in the epic. There's probably more to be said there. So what happens to make him look so different? And of course, the cause of this change is the death of Enkidu, the death of his friend. As he's describing his feelings after the death of his friend, we get some very evocative language that I want to read and sort of pause over with you guys. When Gilgamesh first confronts the death of Enkidu, he has this vocalization of his grief, and you get a sense of how much Enkidu means to him with these lines. So I've highlighted some of them just to bring more attention. So in mourning he says, "The axe at my side, in which my arm trusted, the dirk at my belt, the shield at my face, my festive garment, my girdle of delight, a wicked wind rose up and robbed me." So this is very metaphorical language, very driven by imagery. A wicked wind rose up and robbed me. So he feels that Enkidu has been, robbed of. It was a possession that he had that the wind took from him. It's kind of interesting to think of, your friend as someone who can be stolen from you. And then note all these other metaphors that Gilgamesh uses to describe Enkidu. He's the axe at his side, that his arm trusted. He's the dirk at his belt, the shield at his face. He's a garment. He's a girdle. This is some interesting language, Do you think you would call your friend, your festive garment, your girdle of delight, your shield, your axe? How does it make sense? In what ways is Enkidu like an axe to Gilgamesh? A weapon. Clearly, a weapon he trusts. You might think like, if you are a soldier, perhaps your fellow comrade is someone like a weapon to you, someone you completely trust to protect you if you get in a fight. Enkidu and Gilgamesh get into several, fights, scrapes together. First, fighting each other, and then later fighting Humbaba and Ishtar. The shield at my face, this is kind of interesting. He goes from an axe to a shield in the metaphor. An axe is something that you use in offense to attack, but a shield is something you use in defense to defend yourself. So, Enkidu is both to him. He's, someone that he can fight with alongside against enemies, but he's also someone who will defend him, and that is very true. Enkidu defends Gilgamesh in battle. We start to get into a little bit more strange territory. My festive garment, my girdle of delight. Girdle is usually refers to a very intimate garment, something you wear very close to your naked body. Rather interesting to call your friend your girdle of delight. You might ask yourself, what exactly is Gilgamesh meaning here by referring to his friend in this way? He's making Enkidu metaphorically a piece of his clothing, in all of these examples, clothing or armor. It's rather interesting. It seems like Enkidu kind of fulfilled many roles for Gilgamesh. And so to lose him, we get a feeling of how profound that loss actually is for Gilgamesh. He continues, this seems to be now Gilgamesh turning from thinking about himself and what he's lost with the death of his friend to talking directly to his friend who is dead before him. Now, what is this sleep that has seized you? You've become unconscious. You do not hear me. So the quotation ends here. But he, meaning Enkidu, he lifted not his head. He felt his heart, but it beat no longer. So this is quite kind of interesting. The pronouns seem to shift. He lifted not his head. Clearly the dead man is the one unable to lift his head here. But then this he seems to refer to Gilgamesh. He felt his heart. Gilgamesh felt Enkidu's heart, but it beat no longer. So we get this sort of feeling as the poetic lines go on that, a sort of blend between the two men happen here, with the two he's referring to different nouns. So the pronoun referring to different antecedents, sort of implying perhaps a connection between the two of them. Enkidu, the dead friend, Gilgamesh, the friend who is living, but in mourning for the loss of his friend. So we sort of like realize Enkidu's death alongside Gilgamesh here. It's rather poetic and lovely. Then Gilgamesh continues, he covered like a bride the face of his friend. Like an eagle he circled around him, like a lioness deprived of her cubs. He paced to and fro this way and that. So these lines I really love myself. They seem to show how much Gilgamesh has changed by the death of his friend. Well, first off, we might say this is kind of interesting, that Gilgamesh covers Enkidu's face like a bride. What does that mean? Usually, I guess we get in your mind you might be thinking like perhaps a veil. Sometimes brides have veils that they cover their face with. Gilgamesh doing that here to his friend. But the contexts are quite different between a marriage and a funeral, right? Covering a bride's face is a way, to emphasize her connection to her future husband, maybe her modesty, these sorts of things. When you cover someone's face on their deathbed, it's quite different feelings probably would be aroused there. And then note how different Gilgamesh is. He's acting like an eagle circling around his friend, and then he is likened in a simile to a lioness deprived of her cubs, pacing to and fro this way and that. So you might ask yourself, what do these similes mean? How is Gilgamesh like an eagle circling around? How is he like a lioness deprived of her cubs? This is particularly interesting. Gilgamesh has been such a manly figure throughout this whole epic, but here he's acting like a mother, a lioness deprived of her babies, her baby cubs. So this sort of tells us the profundity of the loss of Enkidu that Gilgamesh feels, and something that you might be thinking, but I'll go ahead and spell it out here. This language of marriage, the bride, a lioness, a mother deprived of her cubs, these sorts of relationships here, like the love between a husband and wife, the love between a mother and son, Gilgamesh is being likened here to these female figures in a way, I think to highlight how much he's changed by the death of his friend. Recall how Gilgamesh was acting tyrannically at the beginning of the epic. He was forcing brides to sleep with him on their wedding night instead of their husbands. Here it seems in losing his friend, he is gaining the kind of knowledge of loss that a mother would feel, or that perhaps like a husband would feel when they lose their bride. Gilgamesh is, I think, learning empathy in a way that he had never had to before. And this is all, of course, occasioned by the death of his best friend. You might have some questions about Gilgamesh and Enkidu's relationship. Some of you will be researching this for your topic. But here's some things just to keep in mind. They have quite a profound relationship. It's interesting. It has many layers to it. So in one way, they are rivals to one another. Remember that Enkidu is created to be an equal to Gilgamesh, someone who can vie with him. You know, vying with someone is rivaling them. So they're kind of designed to be enemies in a way, equals and enemies. They later make good on this. They become combatants with each other, literally. They fight in this square. In the street, Gilgamesh and Enkidu joined combat in the square of the land. They literally fight one another. They become friends. So right after they fight, in fact, they kiss each other and formed a friendship. So this seems to be some sort of like embrace, perhaps more than that, more than friendship, perhaps, I suppose. But you know, their rivalry, their enemy status turns into friendship. And then they literally become brothers. Ninsun adopts Enkidu. O mighty Enkidu, you are not sprung from my womb, this is Ninsun talking, but henceforth your brood will belong with the votaries of Gilgamesh. The priestesses took in the foundling, the divine daughters brought up the foster child, Enkidu, whom I love, I take for my son. Enkidu in brotherhood, Gilgamesh shall favor him. So Enkidu literally becomes the brother to Gilgamesh, the son of Ninsun. So they're like bros, as in friends, and then they become like true bros, as in brothers. They might be more than that too, as you guys might research. Okay, so this is such a profound moment for Gilgamesh, the death of Enkidu. We might pause a little bit and think, why does Enkidu need to die in the Epic of Gilgamesh? Why does he die? There are some literal reasons that have to do with the plot. Humbaba, so plot reasons, sorry, this should be opposite order. So there's plot reasons for his death. Humbaba cursed both Enkidu and Gilgamesh. One in the pair will die, is his curse. There's an assembly of gods who vote on which one will die, how to punish the two men for their acts. They vote that Enkidu will die. Ishtar, the goddess, is angry at Enkidu. He dies perhaps because Ishtar wants him to. We'll learn not only in this epic but in subsequent readings that it's a very bad idea to make a goddess angry, as Enkidu does. So there's the plot reasons. There's many reasons why Enkidu needs to die, but there does also seem to be a thematic reason for the epic. The epic as a whole, its narrative scope. There seems to be some sort of resonance there for Enkidu needs to die for a change to occur in Gilgamesh. There seems to be a lesson implied in Enkidu's death. You might then ask yourself, what is that lesson? What is the lesson for Gilgamesh the character? And then what is the lesson, the sort of moral of the story for the Epic of Gilgamesh as a whole? You might, this is a stone carving that people assume references Humbaba. Humbaba is an interesting character. You might ask yourself a little to think through what he seems to represent. It is after Gilgamesh and Enkidu vie with Humbaba and defeat him that one of them dies. So that does seem to be significant in a way. Humbaba is linked to the flood, which we'll talk about later. His voice is the deluge, they say. His breath is death. Anyway, what does Humbaba represent? You might think about. So we were talking earlier in a slide that Gilgamesh's grief for Enkidu's death is profound. It seems very obvious that he loves this friend. Something else is going on here too. I think this kind of speaks to the thematic resonance of Enkidu's death. Something else motivates his grief. So recall Enkidu's creation. He is created to be the equal of Gilgamesh, one mighty in strength, someone created to vie with Gilgamesh so that Uruk may be rested. So for the sake of the city, Enkidu should vie with Gilgamesh as his equal. Seems kind of interesting. There's strange language of equality throughout the epic. Gilgamesh later, after his friend dies, he has this exclamation, "My friend saw a vision which will never be equaled." What does this mean? My friend saw a vision which will never be equaled. He's referring ostensibly to the death of Enkidu. Enkidu has a dream where he sees himself dying. Maybe this is what he's talking about in terms of a vision that will never be equaled. Interesting. What is going on? Why does the text emphasize equality so much? Is there a link between Enkidu's death and Gilgamesh? I'm sort of hinting here at something that Gilgamesh will later literalize in his motivation for his grief. For his friend Enkidu, Gilgamesh did bitterly weep as he wandered the wild. I shall die, and shall I not then be as Enkidu? Sorrow has entered my heart. I am afraid of death, so I wander the wild, to find Utanapishti, son of Ubar-Tutu. Here it is. This is very rare, actually, to have a character say this so explicitly. I am afraid of death. This is partly what motivates Gilgamesh's grief for Enkidu. He's sad to lose his friend, but he's also sad about the implications. If his friend is his equal, and his friend dies, does not that indicate that Gilgamesh himself may die too? Now, just to pause here a little bit, this seems really obvious, I think. Most people know in some ways, that you will die. I mean, everyone sort of is aware of that. But it's quite a different thing to know that on a conceptual level and to come to know that and to feel the full force of what that will mean. Unfortunately, this is probably going to happen to you. I remember the first time it happened to me when someone who was an exact equivalent to me, or even younger than me, died. It's always a tragedy when things like that happen. But the longer you live, it's a blessing, actually. The longer you live, the more it will happen to you. Exact contemporaries of you, your friends, your brothers, sisters, or people cousins, they'll die. That just is how it works. And it's always very hard because it's not just the death of someone that you loved and had a relationship with, or maybe hated, or whatever it is, but it's the death of the potential for future interactions between you two. You lose a lot when you lose someone, and you become conscious in a way that you probably hadn't been conscious before of what it'll mean when you yourself no longer exist. And so I think this is sort of the realization of Gilgamesh as well. He realizes not only will he die like his friend did, but he'll be, having to deal with that. It's just like it's a lot to take on. And so this is sort of the motivation for the rest of Gilgamesh's journey. I am afraid of death, so I wander the wild. He decides, because he's so afraid of dying, he decides to try to locate this guy, Utanapishti, son of Ubar-Tutu. Utanapishti is the man who was born mortal and becomes immortal. So think of what Gilgamesh is, his sort of character trajectory. He was 2/3 god, 1/3 man. He might have assumed he is a god, and that meaning that he will never die. But when his exact contemporary, his exact equal, Enkidu dies, he knows that that's not true, potentially. He might die too. So he wants to find a way to live forever. So he goes to seek this man. Okay, so then we'll see later language that kind of approximates this idea of equality in the epic as well. When Gilgamesh does meet Utanapishti, he says to him, "I look at you, Utanapishti, your form is no different, you are just like me. You are not any different, you are just like me." So this repetitive structure of the lines. Gilgamesh saying, like, what is the difference between you and me? Why do you get to live forever and I might not? He asks him, how did you find the life eternal? How did you become immortal, Utanapishti? Said Utanapishti to him, to Gilgamesh, "Let me disclose, O Gilgamesh, a matter most secret. To you I will tell the mystery of the gods." So here it is. Utanapishti, the immortal man, tells Gilgamesh he will tell him the secret of immortality. Great. I'd love to know too, Utanapishti. Please tell me. Actually, it's a bit of a trick. The lesson of the gods, the mystery of the gods, is a little bit, yeah, it's probably not what you expected. But like the lesson of Gilgamesh ends up becoming sort of accepting the limitations of being a human. Said Utanapishti to him, to Gilgamesh, "Why, Gilgamesh, do you ever chase sorrow? You who are built from God's flesh and human, whom the gods did fashion like your father and mother. Did you ever, Gilgamesh, compare your lot with the fool? They placed a throne in the assembly and told you, sit." Okay, so this is kind of oblique and cryptic and strange. What does Utanapishti mean by these lines? You know, he was supposed to tell him the secret of immortality, but here's the secret. The secret is, Gilgamesh, you need to think about your lot in comparison with the fool. What is he talking about? This word lot might be strange to you. It's not a common word in English. It's old. It used to be more common in, like, you know, the Renaissance period and stuff. But someone's lot, it's roughly synonymous with your fate. So lot is a person's luck or condition in life, particularly as determined by fate or destiny. So it comes from the same root as the word lottery. You know, like in a lottery, there's one person selected who wins. This is sort of the idea back in like in old myth. You would be assigned a fate by lot, by kind of random chance. You know, perhaps your lot would be to, you know, get married early or something. Maybe your lot is to be a doctor or a lawyer or something like this. Utanapishti tells him, "Did you, Gilgamesh, ever compare your lot with the fool?" So Gilgamesh, did you ever compare your fate with the fate of a fool? They placed a throne in the assembly and told you, sit. So what Utanapishti is telling Gilgamesh here is, don't chase sorrow, Gilgamesh. You know, Gilgamesh here has been going on a quest. He's very haggard, he's tired, he's sad, he's alone. He seems to be chasing sorrow when actually his fate was pretty great. So the people who determine fates, they placed a throne in the assembly and told you to sit. What is Gilgamesh's fate? His fate is to be the king of Uruk. This is a great fate. You know, you would only be so lucky to be picked to be the king of this great city, the biggest city in the world at the time. So Utanapishti is suggesting to Gilgamesh to compare his fate with the fate of a fool, so someone who is not as lucky as him. Just so you know, this will become a common sort of trope later, especially in the medieval period, which is where this image is from, in the West at least. A lot of literature and art likes to depict kings next to fools. You might even think of like a deck of cards. There's always a joker and then, you know, 4 kings and everything. But the king and the fool, they're often put together because they have what the other one lacks. So the king will have all the power, all the political power in the world, but none of the fun, really. It's when you have that much power, you have to be very, very responsible. You don't get to, what you say matters. You don't get to just say whatever you want. You don't really get to like dress like a crazy person or get drunk or these sorts of things. You don't get to have as much fun when you're that powerful. And then on the other hand, a fool gets to have a ton of fun. You know, they're always kind of silly, playing jokes, singing songs, but they have absolutely no political power. So the two of them usually are kind of seen as equals but opposites in a way. So Gilgamesh should think about his own fate and sort of accept that. So the sort of like end result, the moral, I guess, the moral of the story, the moral of the Epic of Gilgamesh is about accepting one's limitations. So this is the lesson that Gilgamesh needs to learn, and it's sort of the lesson that, by extension, we all need to learn in a way, that humans are limited. We are mortal. Uttanapishti says in Tablet 10, the Anunnaki, the great gods, held an assembly. Mamutum, maker of destiny, fixed fates with them. Both death and life they have established, but the day of death they do not disclose. So this is sort of similar to the assembly of gods who decides that Enkidu will die. This happens to all of us. The great gods hold an assembly, and everyone's fate is fixed. You get to live, but you also will die. So death and life are established for each individual, but the day of death they do not disclose. So this is sort of the lesson of the Epic of Gilgamesh, that we are all mortal, we will all die. And I want to kind of speak on this kind of stepping back a little bit. A lot of these early texts deal with mortality as a theme. A lot of early cultures like to think about death because it's scary. It's, we wonder why it happens. We also wonder why we're alive to begin with. Many of these ancient texts think about humans and where they lie on the spectrum from an animal and a god. So humans are kind of in the middle. We are like animals in that we live and die. Gods don't die. We tend to be immortal. So we're a bit like animals, we live and die, but we're also a bit like gods in our capacity for reason and our capacity to be conscious of our mortality. So just like Uttanapishti says here, death and life they have established, but the day of death they do not disclose. So humans know that we will live, we know that we will die, but we just don't know when. So we're godlike in a sense, but we're not gods. We're animal-like in a sense, but we're not animals. So this is also sort of the lesson of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh needs to kind of figure out where he exists on this spectrum, acting too much like a god or too much like an animal. Enkidu is also on this spectrum as well. I mean, he kind of leaves the herd to become human. So that's our lesson, really, but I want to say a little bit more. The limitations of the humans, I think, we can see them in the opening lines of the epic, especially in comparison with the closing lines. So here are the opening lines of the Epic of Gilgamesh. He who saw the deep, the country's foundation, who knew, was wise in all matters. Gilgamesh, who saw the deep, the country's foundation, who knew, was wise in all matters. He everywhere, and learnt of everything the sum of wisdom. He saw what was secret, discovered what was hidden. He brought back a tale of before the deluge. He came a far road, was weary, found peace, and set all his labors on a tablet of stone. He built the rampart of Uruk, the sheepfold, of holy Eanna, the sacred storehouse. So this is our lovely beginning lines. Remember, at the beginning, they seemed very cryptic. We didn't know what the narrator is referring to. I think by the end, we sort of realize a little bit more. Compare these lines to the closing lines. So these lines that emphasize how amazing Gilgamesh is. He's wise in everything, some of wisdom, etc. He's wonderful. He's amazing. Sometimes it seems rather striking how boring the closing lines of the Epic of Gilgamesh are. These lines are kind of strange. You probably got to the end and you're like, what? What's the point of these lines? This is how you end this? So here are the closing lines of the epic. To remind you of the plot here, Gilgamesh is he's come back to Uruk with the help of this riverboat person, Shanabi. So Shanabi has helped him get back to Uruk. And then Gilgamesh shows Shanabi around Uruk. He says, "Oh, Shanabi, climb Uruk's walls and walk back and forth. Survey its foundations. Examine the brickwork. Were its bricks not fired in an oven? Did the 7 sages not lay its foundations? A square mile is a city, a square mile is date grove, a square mile is clay pit, half a square mile the temple of Ishtar, 3 square miles and a half is Uruk's expanse. So this is, again, kind of striking how boring in a sense these last lines are. He starts just kind of talking about real estate, how big the city is, like square miles and everything. This seems kind of cute now when we know cities can be very enormous, but remember Uruk at this time is the largest city in the world, so this would be pretty exciting that like a whole square mile is the city and a square mile is a date grove, etc. But one thing I think is very sweet in a sense is here we have Gilgamesh showing off his city, being proud of his city. I think he's fulfilled what Utnapishti told him to compare his lot, his fate, with that of a fool, and to be grateful for the fact that he was made king of Uruk. They gave you a throne in an assembly hall and told you to sit. Here is Gilgamesh, metaphorically sitting on his throne, being proud of the city of Uruk, and showing it off to someone who's not from there. All its bricks and all of its foundations. So, yeah, I think we kind of see Gilgamesh becoming, he's accepting his own fate. He is mortal, but he's got a pretty great lot in life. He's the king of Uruk, and he should be proud of it. Okay, the limitations of the human. Let's talk a little bit more about that. We'll probably discuss this question in class, because I think there's a lot to be said about the first line of the poem. So the first line of the poem is he who saw the deep. In fact, sometimes the Epic of Gilgamesh is just called He Who Saw the Deep, because that is the first line of the poem. He who saw the deep. He meaning Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is the man who saw the deep. What is the deep? It's capitalized. In English, that means it's a proper noun. It's like important. It's like you capitalize your name in English, or you capitalize the name of the city. The deep is capitalized here. What is the deep? What does Gilgamesh see? We'll definitely talk about this in class. There's various answers that I think can work. One that you might not immediately think of just because you might not know that this is a convention, but especially in ancient texts, the ocean or the sea is often called the deep because it's very deep, right? It's kind of scary, mysterious, unfathomable how deep it is. At a time when people didn't really know, not everyone knew how to swim, for example. They didn't have submarines and this sort of thing. The ocean is a very mysterious, very powerful force that would be very scary. And so the deep might be the ocean. Gilgamesh goes on a quest to the ocean to find Utnapishti, who coincidentally, just kidding, it's not a coincidence, he is the man who survived the flood. So again, like this sense that water, being a powerful and very scary force, is kind of emanating throughout the whole epic. So Gilgamesh being the man who saw the deep does seem significant there. It has something to do with water. But I don't think that's the whole of the story. There's probably more to be said here. We'll talk about it in class and see what your thoughts are. I might ask you a reflection question about this. What is it that Gilgamesh sees? Is seeing the deep akin to seeing his own mortality? Is it seeing death? Is it seeing God, or seeing that he's not a god? What exactly is it that he sees with the deep? And then another question to kind of think about is this idea of immortality being denied Gilgamesh. The editor of our edition titles the last tablet, so the last chapter, he calls it Immortality Denied. But is immortality denied to Gilgamesh? In a sense it is. He is prevented from being a god. He comes to accept that he will die. He's given this weird plant, but like a snake steals it. Anyway, so clearly he's not going to live forever. But in some other ways, Gilgamesh does seem to be immortal. Recall that this poem was written thousands of years ago, and we're still reading it today. So I think that there is a sense in which some things about us can live beyond our own immediate death. So even though humans are mortal, perhaps there's something about us that is immortal, that can live forever, potentially. And I think, there's reason to think that Gilgamesh can. Okay, I'll end it there.